That's disgusting.
Hello y'all, this is Louie and welcome back to Retrosaurus. With each passing generation of consoles, experimentation with new concepts, gameplay systems, visuals, and more become key to pushing the limits of the medium. At the end of the fourth console generation, 3D design came to the forefront, allowing developers to toy with all sorts of neato ideas to breathe life into the added dimensional space. Cinematic concepts such as dynamic camera angles and highly detailed environments became more and more prevalent in genres across the spectrum, leading to breathtaking, memorable set pieces that have stood the test of time. This typically led to console games using pre-rendered cutscenes and backgrounds to flesh out their worlds, not unlike what you would find in adventure games such as Myst on the PC. Over time, developers would begin implementing 3D character models and environments in their games, though completely 3D experiences were still fairly uncommon even well into the PS2 era. Horror games were very slow to adopt fully 3D environments, most notably with the Resident Evil series sticking to using pre-rendered backgrounds with 3D character models in their mainline entries until Code Veronica released on the Dreamcast in 2000. It's definitely worth mentioning that Overblood was able to accomplish a fully 3D horror experience a mere 5 months after the first Resident Evil released. That's really the only notable thing about that game, as it was honestly more horrible than horror. But before Capcom took the plunge into the third dimension with their flagship series, they tested out these concepts in another companion title that was actually developed alongside Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, or Biohazard 3 Last Escape for you weebs in the audience. Of course, we're talking about Dino Crisis, one of my favorite Capcom series. Yes, I know, another one, which has sadly been forgotten by all but the most staunch Resident Evil fans. This also marks the first time we get to talk about a game featuring dinosaurs on the show with a dinosaur pun title, hosted by a man who uses dinosaur as his handle, and had a dinosaur-related nickname as a child. Do not ask me what it is, I have no intention of telling you. While sharing many similarities with Jill's final romp through Raccoon City, Regina's adventure pushed for a more experimental, intimate, and claustrophobic experience that alluded to the trajectory the Resident Evil series was starting to take. Unlike its zombie-ridden older sister, Dino Crisis opted for a more sci-fi inspired thriller approach instead of the former straight-up action horror gorefest. Additionally, the switch from horrific monsters to dinosaurs highlights how much of a product of the 90s it is, as this game would have released alongside sequels to Jurassic Park and Power Rangers, both of which kicked off the dinosaur craze in the early 90s, well, at least they did for me. The series started off more grounded, with clear inspiration drawn from the aforementioned first film in the Jurassic Park series, but as time went on, each subsequent game became more action-oriented. By the third entry, it retained very little if any similarities to its progenitor. Again, not unlike the Jurassic Park series. There really is only one thing that remained consistent throughout its history, and that's the fact it's incredibly inconsistent. The plot, the characters, the gameplay, the dinosaurs even. Very little of what was introduced in Dino Crisis 1 remained by the time the series had its untimely extinction in Dino Crisis 3. Heck, even the quality of the game seemed to go down over time, yet the fandom still holds it quite dear and hounds Capcom for a remake whenever they get the chance. And if you're watching this, Capcom, and I know you aren't, please don't. You've already proven that you don't care enough to put real effort into remakes anymore with Resident Evil 3, so I can't imagine you give proper care and attention to the series' literal redheaded stepchild. So today, I want to explore the experimental nature of the Dino Crisis series, which led to an identity crisis of sorts when you look at the series as a whole. So set your DDKs, grab your fish gun, and prepare for Dangar as we return to Ibis Island to unearth the rotting remains of Cooper. I mean, the Dino Crisis series. Let's go ahead and tick the boxes of a proper Retrosaurus episode and dive into the origins of the Dino Crisis series. Hey, just because the Dino-flavored series we're talking about is inconsistent doesn't mean this one has to be too. Development for the first Dino Crisis was handled by Capcom Production Studio 4, with directorship overseen by the legendary Shinji Mikami of PN03 fame. The series was intended to be somewhat of a pseudo-sequel or companion of sorts to Mikami's previous endeavor, Resident Evil, but with less fantastical or unrealistic elements to make for a more grounded, believable experience. Drawing inspiration from popular sci-fi and horror films such as Jurassic Park and Alien, Mikami set out to create a horror experience that focused less on item management and jump scares, and more on maintaining a persistent feeling of fear and panic. Dinosaurs were chosen over biologically engineered monsters as they are inherently fearsome and intimidating on their own. Plus, this was during the 1990s and dinosaurs were kind of the in thing, not unlike how zombies were the trendy fad during the 360 PS3 generation. Ah, Capcom, ever the trendsetter. To further set itself apart from Resident Evil, pre-rendered backgrounds were dropped in favor of real-time rendered 3D environments, which unfortunately led to a lot less detail in the texture work. This led to the game taking place almost entirely indoors in narrow, claustrophobic rooms and hallways with as much visual diversity as the cast of an Avengers film. Subsequent entries in the series would change up this formula as new ideas and concepts were introduced, leading to incredible inconsistency in tone and gameplay. To make sure everyone is on the same page here, there are 4 canonical entries in the Dino Crisis series. These games are Dino Crisis, Dino Crisis 2, Dino Stalker, aka Gun Survivor 3, wait for it, Dino Crisis, and Dino Crisis 3. We like to pretend that only 1 and 2 exist, but just like Cooper, you can't outrun the truth forever. If you look at the later entries in both franchises, it helps validate my opinion that Dino Crisis as a whole existed merely to test the waters for new ideas in the Resident Evil series, as it was starting to stagnate by the 3rd entry. Additionally, the gameplay differs greatly between entries with no single definition really fitting the franchise except for experimental. This is the closest the series ever came to a defining identity. It's not even the same protagonist appeared in every game. I mean, you don't have to keep the same main character in every game, but with a character like Regina, why would you want anyone else? Jumping into the first Dino Crisis, it was developed alongside Resident Evil 3, with both projects being helmed by God Hand director Shinji Mikami. The game released in July 1999, a mere 2 months prior to RE3 Nemesis, and even included a demo for the game. Later releases and ports of RE3 would return the favor and include Regina as an unlockable costume for Jill. Dino Crisis was the first horror game, in Capcom's care at least, that featured fixed camera angles in a fully 3D environment, with gameplay that resembled Resident Evil, but with its own flair and zazz. Our leading lady Regina could aim, albeit in a very restricted manner, and walk at the same time in addition to pulling off a 180-degree turn. An interesting side note about this game that I absolutely love is that you can play this game as a pacifist. Similar to the knife-only approach in Resident Evil, you could complete this game without firing a single shot, leaving all the poor, confused dinosaurs to continue about their lives in peace, or in pieces depending on your interpretation of how a rocket launcher works. The story is set in the future in 2000, where an elusive scientist by the name of Dr. Kirk is working on a top-secret weapons project in a research facility on the remote Ibis Island, a mere 3 years following his death, I may add. Tom, an undercover agent for SORT, that's the Secret Operations Raid Team, reports his findings back to base and awaits the arrival of our new sassy red-headed heroine, codenamed Regina, who actually never learned her real name, and her 3 teammates, Gale, Rick, and Cooper. Upon arrival, the team soon discovers the factory is abandoned with no signs of life save for the half-eaten corpses of the security team. In order to unravel the mystery of Ibis Island, the team quickly splits up to search the premises, unaware of the countless hordes of dinosaurs that now stalk about. Well, they would have known if Cooper hadn't gotten himself eaten by a T-Rex. You live and learn, I guess. The narrative for this game is interesting, as there are several points throughout the story where you are presented with choices that affect how the story unfolds. Subsequently, the game features 3 distinct endings depending on the choices you make. Gale and Rick will occasionally get into a bit of a lover's quarrel over how to proceed with the mission. In a totally not forced rivalry subplot, Gale tends to be the straight man of the group, pushing for the team to follow the objective directly without any distractions. Rick is quite the opposite, often letting his feelings and emotions get in the way of the mission. Depending on the choices you make, you may meet side characters at various stages of life and solve a variety of different puzzles with multiple solutions. And speaking of puzzles, this is one of the most puzzle-heavy action games I have ever played in my life. There are so many hecking puzzles in this game that it's so hard to keep track of what you have or what you have not found. I actually learned the speedrun of this game just so I could have a better casual experience due to the sheer necessity of a guide when playing this blind. Puzzles in Resident Evil were fairly simple. Find the item, use it in the correct spot. Boom, done, that's all there is to it. In Dino Crisis, however, there are at least 6 doors that require 2 different key items, called DDKs, that need to be set to open them. But you don't just simply set the keys and move on. Oh no, you have to solve another puzzle first. One DDK is the encrypted password, the other is a decoder. Both must be used to solve the puzzle and determine the password. Luckily, these puzzles are consistent in every version of the game, so you can just memorize the answer. Good luck remembering where all the items are located though. There are so many unique puzzles in the game whose number rivals only the amount of unskippable cutscenes you will come across. The research lab, while impressive in its 3D design, is a bit hard to navigate, especially with the completely useless map you are given for reference. Fortunately, the constant meandering and wandering you quickly become wont to do allows for 2 of the cooler aspects of this game to shine. As you make your way through the facility, you'll notice that, unlike Resident Evil games, or even many of its style clones, Dino Crisis features semi-fixed camera angles. What I mean by that is the camera angle is typically fixed at a certain angle, but unlike games with pre-rendered backgrounds, the camera follows Regina as she runs through the rooms. This may seem ridiculous to consider notable nowadays, but this dynamic camera movement was relatively unseen throughout most of the PS1 era, especially in horror games. Well, except for when Overblood did it first, but let's try not to think about that. The dynamic camera also allowed for dynamic enemy movements as well. Unlike zombies, the dinosaur enemies were faster and could follow you through rooms if you took too long lollygagging, which was bound to happen as you were tirelessly looking for the other half of the DD set you need, and you can't tell this hallway or that hallway is the right one because the walls are all shiny and generic white like all the main characters of a Phase 1 Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. This kept the tension and fear persistent throughout the playthrough, as very few rooms were safe. Even some rooms that appear to be clear upon entering would soon welcome in yet another raptor. This idea also reappeared in Resident Evil 3, albeit in a much more limited instance form with Nemesis. Despite all the complaints, the game really was something else when it released. I honestly could go on and on about how much I love this game, despite being the first game to break my no swearing rule on stream that I self-imposed on myself in the early days.
That is the most obtuse, stupid fucking game I've played in a long time. This is the dumbest fucking game I've played in a while. I have not been this frustrated in so long.
I have since become a bit of a sailor mouth butt munch in the process, but it do be like that sometimes. The new camera system and fully 3D environments would go unused in Capcom's hands until Code Veronica released the following year. Given CV's development health, it makes sense that they would have tested out all the intended concepts and ideas in another game while development restarted. Fun fact, that game was actually supposed to be a numbered entry while Resident Evil 3 was the side game. I wonder if that timeline got better follow-ups to Dino Crisis, as it's rough waters from here on out. The second Dino Crisis entry took a hard right turn when it released the following September. Unlike the first game, the 3D environment, dynamic camera, and stalking enemies were replaced by what more resembles an RE clone than anything else. Pre-rendered backgrounds returned to breathe life into the new jungle environment, and all things considered, they really are spectacular to look at even now. Regina returns in all her sassy glory, alongside a new meat-headed butt munch named Dylan, though he really looks more like a Chad to be honest. The story picks up following the best ending of Dino Crisis 1, after the Third Energy Project transported an entire city into a prehistoric-looking alternate future. Throughout the game, you switch between our dual protagonists with their own abilities and equipment. Puzzle gameplay was replaced by various types of action sequences, including piloting a tank and first-person rail shooter segments. If you can't already tell, the survival horror tension was completely dropped in favor of combo-based shoot-'em-up mechanics with purchasable guns and upgrades. Seeing how Code Veronica had already released earlier in the year, Capcom would have started work on the next Resident Evil, which just like its Dreamcast exclusive predecessor, was going through a bit of development hell itself. It's interesting to see what I consider a regression in terms of design with this game compared to the groundbreaking original Dino Crisis. Sure, the game has more of an action focus, which may be in part due to Vanquish director Shinji Mikami being replaced by Shu Takumi of Ace Attorney fame. Even when I speak to other fans of the series, they mention that while Dino Crisis 3 was a more fun arcade game to play, without fail they will always mention how the original was far more interesting as a puzzle-based horror experience. But seeing how many of these elements found their way into Resident Evil Outbreak and later Resident Evil 4, it feels like yet another testing bed for the RE series. Dino Crisis 2 released only a skosh more than a year after the first, so it may just be the result of a rush sequel capitalizing on the aging PlayStation console and the success of the original game. Unfortunately, this was the path the series would continue down for what remained of its short life. In a mere 3 years, the series would see its final 2 entries release. Alright, let's just quickly get this next title out of the way. Dino Stalker, aka the third Gun Survivor title and the only one to not be part of the Resident Evil series, was the sole first-person entry in the franchise. Initially developed and planned to be an arcade release, Capcom instead shifted resources and development to the PS2, while retaining the light gun gameplay in addition to standard first-person shooter controls. The title continues from the end of Dino Crisis 2, where generic World War II army guy named Mike Wired is shot down over the Atlantic and transported into the dinosaur-ruled future from the previous game. Over the course of the story, he meets Paula, the young woman who appeared during Regina and Dylan's outing, and soon falls in love with her despite her having a childlike mind and very little command of human language. I honestly can't remember how old Paula is supposed to be, but the whole situation creeps me out. Moving on. The game echoes back to the changes found in Dino Crisis 2, with fast-paced, combo-based gunplay with a slew of new weapons and dinosaurs alike. A majority of the stages are on foot, allowing you to move at your own pace somewhat, with 1 or 2 rail shooting segments to boot. The more methodical first-person gameplay would return in Dead Aim, but that's really all this game shares with it. Not much really happens in the story with this game. You can tell they were kind of floundering to shoehorn in some kind of continuation to get Dino Crisis fans to buy their cheaply made light gun shooter. Unfortunately, this game is the last title that carried on this timeline, as the final game in the series took yet another sharp right turn to become one of the worst, most frustrating games I have ever played in my life. And I've played a whole lot of garbage games, but Dino Crisis 3 pushed even my limits. Now for the final, most disappointing entry in the series Regina built, Dino Crisis 3. This entry marks the first time this franchise was developed for a non-Sony console at launch, though it was initially considered for both the PS2 and the Xbox until it was realized the PS2 was fairly limited in terms of horsepower. In order to not compromise their vision, the game was developed exclusively for the Microsoft Xbox in order to see their compromised vision reach its full potential. If you are confused by that statement, let me explain the turbulent history of the title. Production of the game started mid-2000 and was planned to continue the storyline from the previous entry. Led by Hiroyuki Kobayashi, the game was going to be reminiscent of the original Dino Crisis with more focus on the human drama, with branching decisions that would allow players to alter the future outcome of the story. Once again, it would take place in a research facility, but this time in a city infested with dinosaurs out of their own time. It's unclear if there were to be more areas outside of this facility, as the setting would have theoretically allowed players to explore more wide open areas around the city. Allegedly, this scenario was scrapped during development after the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11th, 2001. There are some articles and interviews that reference this reason as a shift in setting and premise, but they seem to be lost to time and GameSpy servers no longer existing. But if the Dino Crisis fan wiki can be trusted, this would indeed explain the radical departure for the series. So, as development restarted and the entire scenario was scrapped, we are left with a festering pile of bullheck that actually came to fruition. Unlike every previous entry, this takes place far in the future in 2548, in space, on the spaceship Ozymandias. It only goes downhill from here, y'all. After losing contact with Earth over 300 years ago, the ship was finally located near Jupiter, appearing out of thin air. After a devastating attack by the mysterious ship, 4 survivors of SOAR, that's the Special Operations and Reconnaissance Team, made their way back to the ship to uncover the mysterious disappearance and reappearance of it after centuries of hiding. We soon meet our new protagonist, Patrick, and his partner, the Regina reminiscent Sonia, before being attacked by the new threat. Space, dinosaur, things. Yeah. The enemies in this game are not actually dinosaurs, despite sporting similar features and shapes, though they seem almost Resident Evil BOW-like. In actuality, the enemies in this game are human-dinosaur hybrids created by an AI supercomputer that are destined to return to Earth for repopulation as the savior of the human race. I typically don't like to spoil the narrative for people in this video series if I can help it, but I can't imagine anyone will be playing this game as you have to track down an original Xbox and the game to even attempt it. The story rarely makes sense and none of the characters get much characterization, which is pretty standard for a Capcom game. I mean, look at Resident Evil. Chris and Jill have as much characterization and depth as a Zack Snyder script. Really, the story isn't even the most offensive thing about this game, but I'm still salty over losing Regina. The gameplay of this game is one of the worst I've ever seen. Fully 3D environments return as you fix camera angles and fast shoot 'em up combat, with the occasional first-person perspective. It's like they just smashed everything together from the previous games and just hope for the best. Additionally, vertical platforming movement was introduced alongside a jetpack to make the game fast-paced and action-heavy. Let me tell you what the worst feeling in the world is. Trying to maneuver through a room, swimming with wiggly little butt munchers while platforming with rapidly changing camera angles. This ship, while interesting in its ability to transform and change different environments, was confusing to traverse as nearly everything looked the same. The varied arsenal that Patrick packs was interesting to use, when it worked at least, but the overall difficulty of the game was a significant increase from previous games. I don't usually have too much trouble on normal difficulty for most games, but I was struggling to get through this game on easy mode for a plethora of reasons. The game was designed by some sort of sadist given how poorly everything meshes together. I can't imagine what they may have been planning for Resident Evil when looking at this title, though it could be very well that this was the first time they planned a Dino Crisis to just be its own thing, but then again, it may only appear that way due to the fact this game tanked very hard. The game was a critical and commercial failure, which has sadly led to the series' demise as Capcom long held that they aren't sure what to do with the IP anymore. And so the book closed on the short yet rocky history of the Dino Crisis series. Though the series seems to have been created simply to test the waters for new ideas for a different series entirely, it did achieve quite a bit in its own right. The first 2 titles were quite successful and remained influential in the horror genre for years after their release. It's sad to see it end on such a sour note with no redemption arc, and I doubt we'll see it anytime soon. Personally, if there were to be a resurgence in popularity and demand to get a reboot or a sequel, I can only hope they return to the feel of the original game, as it's not often we get a truly tense horror experience. Looking back on how the series derived inspiration partly from from Jurassic Park and the Alien franchises. Revisiting those ideas could be the key to success in the modern gaming market. Something that recreates the ever-present threat of the dinosaurs, something reminiscent of the kitchen scene from Jurassic Park meets Alien Isolation, could be the spark of inspiration that returns Dino Crisis to its glory days. Though, to be perfectly honest, I'm fine with the series remaining dormant in perpetuity, instead of getting a half-assed reskin version of Resident Evil 2 remake yet again. This is advice that Silent Hill fans should consider taking, as that series is similarly dead to rights, and it's about time that they accepted it, because oh boy, it's been really sad lately. Well, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Retrosaurus. If you enjoyed the video, a like and a comment go a long way, and subscriptions help grow the channel. Make sure to share this video with your friends on Facebook, so your Aunt Rhonda can come over and ask me how to plug in her microwave. This series is supported by you lovely lot on Patreon. If you are interested in supporting the series more directly, please look in the description for a link. And you can find me on all social media networks at KyoryuHunter, which is easier to spell than it is to say. And with that, thank you again so much for watching. My name is Louie, and I will see you next time on Retrosaurus. Goodbye.